delighted that Robert and company were able to help bring me here. I love speaking about Kirby. I wrote a book about Kirby. It came out just in time for New Year's called Hand of Fire, The Comics Art of Jack Kirby. And far from exhausting my interest in that subject, writing that book just made Kirby a bigger and more exciting and more important subject in my mind. So I'm sure that I'm not done with the study of Jack Kirby. I think that's an inexhaustible, bottomless well. I should preface my talk with an admission that my title is perhaps a little bit misleading. One, because my interest in Kirby goes well beyond superhero comics. And two, because I'm not entirely convinced that his long-term influence on superhero comics has been completely positive. But perhaps that's a topic we can come back to in the Q&A. For now, I'd like to argue a particular thesis about Kirby's relationship to superhero comics, in effect, drawing together or distilling themes and concerns from several chapters of Hand of Fire. So I'd like to start by giving you a sense of my book's flavor and reading a few extracts from his introduction. A wall of white stone stands alone in a barren, wind-whipped field. Rugged, yet ageless, unadorned, enigmatic, and still. The wall is a slab that rises higher than any man is tall. A silent sentinel, this slab stands as if waiting. For what? A man approaches in the aspect of a pilgrim, frayed and war-weary, staff in hand. He stops before the wall. Inside himself, this man is bearing a heavy weight. The wall stands as if in expectation, as if waiting for the man to reach out, to speak out. Suddenly the man cries aloud, shaking his staff toward the wall, flinging his name and his terrible burden outward as if in challenge. Abruptly, the wall answers in the form of an explosive waboom, and a hand of fire sweeps across the slab, writing on its obdurate white surface in flaming characters a message of grace, inspiration, and counsel. Across the wall, this pyrographic hand inscribes its meaning, transforming blank whiteness into a signifying surface. Its index finger, pointing, writing, is a stylus of fire. Its message is so much cosmic calligraphy or cartooning. Here, faced by this synthetic hand-me-down image, and I think many of us will recognize it as an echo of the prophetic writing on the wall from the biblical book of Daniel, also the inscribed tablets of Exodus, perhaps too a reminder of Michelangelo's hand of God with his finger pointing at creation. Here we are in the graphic world of Jack Kirby, cartoonist. The image hails from a late career work by Kirby, the comic book The New Gods, number 7, which he wrote and drew late in 1971. This comic was said to be one of Kirby's favorites. If Kirby's pilgrim character, Isaiah is his name, is obviously confronting God when he meets that wall, it takes only a little critical chutzpah to see the wall's provoking whiteness as also the, to a cartoonist, ever-challenging white blank of the uninscribed page. Characteristically, Kirby sees the absolute, what he calls the source with the capital A, as an inscribing hand, and its message as an act of divine graphiation. Yet the text on this comics page tells us it's not the wall so much as the pilgrim who must communicate. It is the man who must put the question to the source wall and provoke its answer. The question is born of desperation, out of a life of violence, struggle, and confusion. The answer is delivered in a typically robust Kirby fashion, an explosion and then a vision. This is the kind of delirious, epic myth-making that Jack Kirby brought to comics. Many of you will know that Kirby was an American cartoonist and writer embedded in comics, a field that he entered while still in his teens back in the 1930s, and which he worked in very nearly full-time for more than 40 years. Kirby spent his life working steadily at comics, in particular the periodical comic book. That is, the rough half-tabloid-size, newsstand-ready comics magazine as it was developed in the mid-30s. And that format, the comic book, so beloved of collectors and price guides, still represents for many the kernel of American comics. And it was in that format that Kirby excelled. With his dynamic, eccentric style, Kirby left a deep and unmistakable handprint both on the comic book medium and on the industry that grew up around it. That his work has been so widely imitated to the point of becoming an industry standard in the 1960s does not lessen its eccentricity, its strange charm and energy. But it has made it more difficult to truly appreciate Kirby's impact. Influence, when widespread enough, camouflages itself. Kirby became, over 40-plus years of almost uninterrupted comic book production, part of the very atmosphere breathed by comics artists and fans, indeed an inescapable constant of the comic book culture. And so Kirby-esque is a familiar adjective to comic book fans. And doing Kirby is something that many, many comics artists have attempted, some repeatedly, some even obsessively. In short, Jack Kirby is one of the premier visual stylists and storytellers, for some readers, the premier artist in American comic book history. Starting in the late 30s, persisting to the late 70s, Kirby produced comic book work on a monthly basis with but one significant interruption: his time as an infantryman during the Second World War. He was to carry this war experience around with him for the rest of his life, often telling war stories full of odd details and spiced with a generous sense of the absurd. He told some real corkers when it came to the war. By most accounts, he was a voluble yarn spinner, particularly where the war was concerned. He had a fund of battlefield stories, tales so tall that many listeners wondered about their truthfulness, but that he told with absolute conviction. These stories from then on were to inform his work and his life, as indeed nightmares about the war are said to have dogged his sleep for the rest of his days. Kirby's sense of life was, by all evidences, founded on conflict. We all get this idea that stories require conflict. Creative writing 101. That's a familiar teaching. To Kirby, that idea was not a learned abstraction. Actually, it was a gut-level understanding, a basic intuition stemming from his violence-fraught childhood in the claustral tenements of New York's fabled Lower East Side. Born Jakob, or Jakey Kurtzberg, the first son of Austrian Jewish immigrants, Kirby would characterize his early days, his founding days, as nail-tough, hard-scrabble days, full of street fights and physical threats. A kid interested in reading and drawing might have had a crushingly hard time in an environment like that. But Kirby, a true scrapper, learned to weather the violence of what he later called the street code. And like a boxer, he seemed to carry with him forever after a mix of seething anger, pugnacious self-sufficiency, brashness really, but also gentlemanly kindness. And it's that kindness that is fondly remembered by his colleagues and fans. There have been many, many in-depth descriptions of Kirby the man. Unfailingly, they reveal a generosity of spirit and gentleness with his family and friends, which belie the brawling ferocity, the kinetic oomph, and the tamped-down, rechanneled anger that mark his best-known work. As much as any artist, Kirby embodied what was necessary to survive in the comic book industry in those days: the unflagging speed, energy, and eagerness to please that were part of the toolkit of the early comic book artist. Your pal, Jack Kirby. Yet over the long haul, Kirby and his family suffered from the instability bred by that industry's conditions and practices. He was perhaps uniquely adapted to an industry that nonetheless treated him pretty poorly. And ironically, his drive to survive that treatment, to prosper under those conditions, is the very thing that led him to become the master of impatient, explosive, hyperkinetic action comics. Eventually, he became so well-conditioned that he was incapable of working at anything other than full tilt. The circumstances that demanded constant output from Kirby, and therefore made his work so uneven in quality, are the same circumstances that shaped his signature style. So his powers as an artist are inseparable from the working conditions that over the years caused him so much grief. Right? Kirby galvanized many comic book genres. He worked basically in every then popular genre of comic books. He had a long, mazy, crazy, bemusingly complex career. And so it seems a little strange that he should be known mainly as the superhero artist par excellence. But he is linked to superheroes the way that, in my mind, let's say John Ford is linked to Westerns. Kirby excelled at superheroes, and his outlook or sensibility lives in them. So though he was at home in many genres, none proved more hospitable to him than superheroes, which increasingly over the course of the 1960s and 70s enabled him to get at different issues, themes, and characters, to crystallize and grow into his trademark late style, to attempt stories of apocalyptic scope, harking back to our previous panel as we were speaking about the apocalypse, about possible futures in comics. To attempt stories of apocalyptic scope, which gave his graphic imagination freer play and greater challenges, and in sum, to raise the stakes of the newsstand comic book. During the 60s, this new infusion of Kirby's graphic energy and high-concept bravura, shamelessness really, and mythopoeic grandeur practically transformed superheroes into a new genre, one that has sustained the comic book specialty market and fandom for decades, and now hails us so very often from multiplex and television and video game screens as well. So there's a lot of reasons why Kirby is linked to superheroes, even though there's so very much more in his career that's worthy of mention. For one thing, the superhero genre fit his violent, conflict-driven gut impulses as a storyteller. I was trying to get at the other guy before he got at me. That's something he once said in an interview. It fit his instincts. For another, Kirby contributed novel and exciting work to superhero comics at two different stages of his career, both during the formative age of comic books in the 1940s, in fan parlance, the Golden Age, but also during the transformative or Silver Age of the 60s. Another reason that Kirby is linked to superheroes is that through superheroes, Kirby stretched as a cartoonist graphically and thematically, nudging the genre in the direction of science fiction and epic fantasy. And this trend began at Marvel Comics in the 60s. A fourth reason is that Kirby's work on the Marvel heroes, in particular the Fantastic Four and Thor and Captain America in the 60s, established the definitive and often imitated late Kirby style, which is the visual blueprint for so many subsequent superhero comics, and which indeed Marvel embraced as something like a house style during this 60s period. Those artists, and this includes many very skilled artists who already had a track record of years at work in comics, those artists who struggled to adapt to Marvel's dynamism, to Marvel's style, were given layouts by Kirby or instructions by Kirby or an injunction by editor Stanley to do it the way Jack does. This includes industry veterans who were basically told to draw differently and work differently because of Kirby's influence. So a kind of house style. Through these books, Kirby became the Kirby known to most present-day comic book fans, and he became the default stylist for a while for superhero comics. Finally, and most famously, perhaps most controversially, Kirby designed much of the Marvel universe of characters and concepts, establishing the brand now owned by the publicly traded Marvel Entertainment Corporation, or rather its owner, the Walt Disney Company, and in recent years assiduously adapted into other media and merchandising. Kirby, in collaboration with Stan Lee, who was then Marvel's leading scriptwriter and editor-in-chief, co-created a host of properties. The litany is very long. Among the most obvious are the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, the X-Men, the Avengers, the Silver Surfer, the Black Panther, and so on, often providing the initial spark of inspiration for these characters and almost always setting the look of the characters from then on. It's an extraordinary thing to think of a guy working his way through the night in the basement of his house in Long Island, frankly improvising, flying by the seat of his pants, and to see that many of those self-same designs have altered very little or not at all in the next 50 years. That's interesting. More than anything, and here I'm going to leave behind the text of my book for a bit, Kirby gave superhero comic books a greater scope. He gave them an expanded canvas, a sense of larger possibilities. if in the 60s and 70s superhero comics moved from an episodic to an epic structure, or better yet, an epic and episodic structure. Kirby, more than any other single creator, was responsible for that. The fact that the genre now so often deals with the apocalyptic, again, as we were discussing in our previous panel, with the revelation, potential destruction, and recreation of worlds, whole worlds, is testimony to Kirby's peculiar genius for this genre. Kirby jacked up the threat level in superhero comics. He broadened the range and scale of the threats. He introduced to the genre a sense of discovery, of secret history, of mythic origins and eschatology, a sense of endings and new beginnings, turning costumed heroics into a means by which comic books could approach the grand, mind-rattling themes of epic fantasy. The fact that so many superhero comics today work at the level of the whole world or universe, if not multiverse, is testimony to Kirby's strange gift. Comic books drawn and plotted and later scripted by Kirby, including the Fantastic Four, Thor, the New Gods, and the Eternals, made the superhero genre a bridge between high and low fantasy. The grand and cataclysmic on the one hand, the low mimetic, comical and absurd on the other, the cosmic and the urban, the epic and the crime story, the sublime vista and the lowly grotesque caricature. Kirby knitted it all together, crazily, vitally, giving the superhero genre an infusion of energy that I believe enabled it to survive and seduce further generations of fans. Now, Jack Kirby was able to do this for three reasons, all of which I try to tackle in my book. One is that the production method at Marvel Comics in the 60s favored narrative drawing. That is, it put cartoonists in the driver's seat narratively, allowing stories to be generated graphically through images rather than simply scripted and then illustrated afterward. This is the Marvel method that Gretchen referred to in her paper earlier today. Kirby's graphic imagination, which was never an abstract thing, it was always tied to the process of drawing, slipped the tethers in the 60s and basically went wild. Pressurized by production demand at Marvel, Kirby broke out, and in so doing, he provided later superhero comics with much of their visual and thematic vocabulary. Secondly, Kirby had grown up with what they used to call costume books, with the superhero genre, having done costume comics from 1940 onwards. And so he'd seen the genre come and go. Remember that comic book sales were at their absolute peak in numbers in the early 1950s when superheroes were basically dead or dying on the vine, right? He'd seen the genre come and go, and basically by 1950 it was mostly gone, and he had seen that. He had witnessed, and in fact he had helped to fuel the genre's rebirth in the late 50s and early 60s. And so he was able to reapproach the materials of early superhero comics, those of the mythic Golden Age, with a new degree of self-consciousness. He knew what superhero comics had been before. So he could re-inhabit that genre in a more seasoned and self-aware way, reusing old characters and concepts, but cranking them up to new levels. Thirdly, Marvel, driven in part by Kirby's genius for visual storytelling, in part by Steve Ditko's, as we saw in the documentary film here last night, and in part by the genius of the system presided over by editor Stan Lee, pursued an elaborate Byzantine continuity among its titles, what Jeff earlier referred to as complex, convoluted superhero comic book continuity. This elaborate Byzantine continuity pioneered a shared world concept, which basically became the core editorial principle of work-for-hire superhero comics, that is, multi-author superhero worlds. Marvel was the first to explore fully the potential of interlocking superhero comics, again, as what Jeff called a soap opera earlier, or what some scholars, I'm thinking of Pat Harrigan and Noah Wardrip-Fruin here, have called a vast universe. It's what we now know as the superhero universe. By now, the vast narratives of Marvel and its rival, DC Comics, have even surpassed comic books and gone on to colonize other media. Despite the inevitable incoherence of universes created in this piecemeal fashion, worlds in which disparate characters such as Iron Man and Thor or Batman and Darkseid can coexist and make demands on each other. Despite this absurdity, the notion of the shared world has proven irresistibly attractive to storytellers, adapters, and fans in the decades since, nurturing a fandom fairly obsessed with continuity and the potential of the crossover, right? It's interesting, by the way, how these notions of continuity and the crossover have moved beyond the comic book fandom in particular into many other kinds of transmedia franchises. You could say the superhero comic book was a laboratory for the development of terms so that people now discussing the Whedonverse, right, or other things could have these same tools at their disposal, these same terms or labels. Now, of course, Kirby didn't do all these things on his own, but his grand designs for Marvel and the sheer amount of raw material, characters, designs, and story premises that he gave to Marvel between about 1961 and 65 or 6 provided the necessary scope for Marvel's universe and its fandom's fixation on continuity. Now, I want to return to my first numbered point here, which is narrative drawing. Now, that's the biggest step that I made while I was writing Hand of Fire. It was learning to think more deeply about drawing as a process of generating stories, not just illustrating, but drawing as a way of making things up. Kirby preferred not to work from full scripts. He liked to take his story ideas and turn them into full-fledged stories right at the drawing board. And indeed, the way he did that amazed even his partners and coworkers when they would observe him. What happened at Marvel in the 1960s under Stan Lee's editorship freed Kirby, as well as other cartoonists, most notably the great Steve Ditko, freed them to draw stories into life. Marvel's prolificacy, its output, its energy were owed to the narrative inventiveness of Kirby and Ditko and their fellow cartoonists. But none, I think, more than Kirby, who designed more aspects of Marvel's budding continuity than any other single artist. Now, we know that Stan Lee set his artists loose to work out and to build out from the basic premises of the Marvel comics. And we know that he often got from them more, much more, than the faithful execution of agreed-upon plots. What he got from Kirby was at the least genuine co-creation, genuine new premises. Under the Marvel style, and again, I'll crib a bit from my book here, the artist independently created breakdowns, meaning page layouts and drawings, rough drawings at the least, but often thoroughly detailed drawings, after which the nominal writer would supply the dialogue and captions. The writer, then, was more accurately a scripter or a reviser after the fact, a dialoguer responsible for placing text on already determined layouts. Said layouts, by the way, often included not only images but also rough textual notes by the artists. This production method called on the artists to break down plots and lay out pages on their own, without minute, step-by-step, page-by-page input from another scenarist. But this Marvel style or Marvel method was a pragmatic accommodation to an unremitting production demand. What you had was a very small operation, small editorially and small in terms of its total pool of freelancers producing a lot of comics and an increasing number of comics with tremendous production pressure. So Stan Lee and Marvel Comics came to depend on this method of production. Practically speaking, the method freed up a lot of Stan Lee's time, as he was not responsible for making decisions about breakdown or staging at the script phase, and he did not have to work through the details of physical actions or confrontations. These he left to the kinetic sensibilities of his artists. Can you make a whole page out of speed lines and impact lines? Maybe you can. And Stan Lee also did not have to worry about dialogue until confronting nearly finished pages, a mercy that allowed him to attack the pages as found objects with an improvisational flair, which helps account for the freshness and vivaciousness of his best scripting, as well as the blithe excesses of his worst. Stan Lee, you might say, was a willful translator of this work, reinterpreting the artist's sequences and intentions, writing over something that already existed, not in finished form, certainly, but in a substantially developed form. Sometimes his translations were faithful, sometimes not, and that became a bone of contention for some of the artists, Kirby and Ditko in particular. Lee's work came most often at the fore end in the initial consultation with the artist and the aft end, the dialogue and captioning, leaving the middle to the artist. Now, that all-important middle included, at the least, layout, pacing, staging, the working out of transitions and minor plot points, and the choreographing of action, all the ingredients of sequential narrative drawing, all the elements of page design, composition, and reader orientation, of dramatic visual emphasis, tonal control, gesture, and expression. In the case of Kirby and Steve Ditko in the mid-'60s, the middle also included much more than that. At the least, the occasional creation of major characters out of whole cloth, the frequent introduction of supporting characters, the staging of complex, extended, and emotionally fraught sequences, and moments of intervention that startled even Lee. So what Kirby and Ditko provided to Lee was not illustration, but concepts, characterization, plot points, and full-fledged narrative drawing, that is, storytelling via images, with recourse to all the myriad devices, all the visual shorthand of cartooning. Cartooning is storytelling. So while the Marvel method lightened Lee's workload, it made greater demands on the artist's time and energy, and so it reinforced those artists' sense that they were working on stories for which they could claim substantial creative credit. As Lee's contributions to the initial plotting eased off, freeing him to act as the editor and production manager and increasingly the promoter of the expanding line of Marvel Comics, Ditko and Kirby grew into their own, supplying entire plots and new properties, and eventually stamping their respective comics with their design sensibilities, predispositions, even their moral outlooks or glimmerings of same, all while Lee remained the nominal writer of the books. This eventually became an irksome arrangement for some of these artists. So I would argue that the reason superhero comics became more vital and interesting in the mid-'60s is that Marvel, in contrast to the editor and scriptwriter-dominated DC then, and in contrast to the production of most superhero comics now, set talented narrative artists free to dream up stories through their art. The point is worth underscoring because it's still so poorly understood, although I think probably better understood here at CCAD, at an art school, and many other places. This point is still not generally well understood. The Marvel Universe, all that sort of stuff, did not arrive in a purely conceptual form as a set of abstract, portable notions. Instead, it always arrived graphically through a process of narrative drawing. Try to explain the Silver Surfer to somebody in the abstract. It's very difficult. Just show them a couple of pages of Jack Kirby circa 1966-67. It's a lot easier. They may still giggle, but it's a lot easier to explain, right? Because the drawing sells the notion, it animates the notion. To paraphrase Donald Phelps, cartooning is not merely the inscription of imagination. It's imagination's vehicle. It's the conductor of imagination, a process of ideation, of design, and world building. Between 1961 and 66, Kirby plotted and laid out overwhelmingly more comics and launched more new properties than anyone else at Marvel. He supplied the company with raw material at a mind-boggling pace. Go look at a list or a graph of his monthly productivity in 1963 and 64 and 65, and even into 66, although gradually his workload began to ease off a bit. At the mid-decade, as if galvanized by the sheer pressure, Kirby erupted. The power of his artwork took a hurtling headlong forward leap, rivaling the intensity of his best pre-Marvel cartooning, but taking on a new, more massive, and more brutally stylized look. His design sense frothed over. His costumes, gadgets, and characters hit a new level of Baroque lavishness. At the same time, he began to treat the superhero as a vehicle for high fantasy and science fiction. Graphic mythopoesis, by which I mean uninhibited world building, was the order of the day. Kirby chased after ideas and visions that superhero comics had not had the nerve to approach before. His yen for the cosmic, for the gargantuan, and the technological sublime ushered in a sense of scope and possibility unprecedented in the genre. In particular, the Fantastic Four and Thor supplied the cosmic scale and the stylistic template for much of what has happened in the genre since then. And as I recount in my book, Kirby chased this aesthetic through many later comics, from the New Gods or Fourth World Saga to the Eternals to 2001, with mixed, but to me always fascinating results. So that's what Kirby did for and to the superhero. So much of what has made that genre bigger, more ambitious, more epic, but also, frankly, more specialized, more hermetic, and more bizarre, started at Kirby's drawing board. That's the case that Hand of Fire makes, which is why I call Kirby Marvel's co-author and the household god of superhero comics. At this point, I'd be delighted to take your questions. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Yeah, I had a question about the narrative, so wouldn't that be detrimental in the long run in terms of continuity?
What about the what?
Wouldn't the narrative, just letting artists go about be detrimental in the long run in terms of continuity?
It's interesting you should say that because Marvel often sent photocopies to Jack Kirby in order to help him trace or keep track of continuity, which he was famously not very good at. So they would send him traces of his previous month's work. I mean, Kirby works so tirelessly that he never actually looked at, well, I don't believe he often looked at the published comics themselves, right? He couldn't. He was endlessly pushed onward. So, for example, if you take a very Baroque costume, like Odin's or Galactus's in the Thor or Fantastic Four, these would be festooned with detail. Which came straight from Kirby's mind to the page. And that detail meant a lot to him. It was graphically interesting. It filled the space. It made the characters impressive. But he would get some of the details wrong, reportedly. And so he would be asked to reconsult photocopies of his pencils or pages from previous months in order to nail that down, right? Now, today we live in a different context, I think, where the sort of shared superhero world is often created or recreated or relaunched or revamped through a colossal shared effort. If you think about Age of Apocalypse, which Jeff was talking about in our last panel, that required a lot of editorial mediation among a large set of titles. It couldn't only be the work of the chief scripter and artist in X-Men. It had to be a round-the-table, conference table kind of thing. And indeed, lots of superhero publishers, both Marvel and DC and also others that have disappeared since the 90s, would gather writers for seminars and plot out 6 months or 12 months of Superman and so on and so forth. I personally find that approach to comic book creation a little constraining, but it does create a world where, like the Judge Dredd world that Douglas was discussing, one can seed plot points and then exploit them 5 or 10 years later, which Kirby seldom did that, right? Because he was like a rocket on the end of a tether, and the tether was barely holding him. But have I gotten at your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, your point is well taken. If it's an act of graphic improvisation, which I think a lot of this was, people are likely to let continuity slip. And some of the effects that you could get in Marvel comics, let's say in the 70s and after, the Avengers Defenders War or the Kree Skrull War, that requires a lot more studious study of the previous months and years' comics to pull off. I think Kirby was congenitally much too impatient and restless to really deal with that kind of thing. But people who came after him were able to consolidate it and deal with it. That's a good question. Continuity is something that my book has a love-hate relationship with, as I have had as a comics reader. Other questions? Please. Yes?
I may have misheard, but when did Jack Kirby join? Did he join Marvel?
He didn't. Well, keep going with your question before I try to leap in. Yeah.
And if he did, how much of a gamble was it for him to work that way? How much did they have to lose to let him do that style of story?
Well, there's a 2 or 3 part backstory here. One is that Marvel had almost nothing to lose. This was a pitifully shrunken company that was at death's door in the late 1950s. I mean, it had next to nothing. It had no rep. It had low page rates. It had a shrunken line. It once had an enormous line, a huge volume of output, But because of a distribution contract that was frankly onerous, Marvel was sort of, literally contractually limited to X number of comic book releases per month. They were sort of beaten back into a corner by a variety of changes in the market and catastrophic business decisions in hindsight. The other thing is that Kirby himself didn't have a lot to lose. He needed the work, and he'd suffered a terrible setback due to complex circumstances when he was freelancing for one of Marvel's principal rivals at the time, National, or DC, as we know them. And Kirby had work at DC doing comics like The Challengers of the Unknown. He sort of got shunted out of there through a poisoned relationship with an editor there and through his own perhaps iffy decisions. But the first part of this story is that he was one of the most successful sort of jobbers in the comic book business from the early 40s through the early mid-50s. He with Joe Simon, together, Simon and Kirby were not just two men. They were a brand name, SNK, Simon and Kirby. They were seriously huge. They created romance comics, for example. They made a mint from that. So Kirby had fallen very, very far. He had fallen precipitously from a level of professional envy that other artists might have felt toward him to a level of, frankly, desperation. He said, I needed to make sales. His family needed to be taken care of. And so by 1958, 59, when he returned to mostly working for what became known as Marvel, he still had a few jobs here and there. Like he did a Classics Illustrated job in the early 60s, for instance, even while he was drawing Marvel comics. He returned there because he needed it. And Marvel had nothing to lose because they had no reputation at this point. They certainly didn't have the kinds of sales that they had enjoyed in previous generations. So, there was something there that Martin Goodman, who owned and published Marvel Comics as part of his larger empire, and that frankly, Goodman's employees, Stan Lee, realized that they could use, which was Kirby's desperation, his readiness, his willingness, and his talent, which he had proven ever since the late 30s. So there's a pretty long story there. Marvel didn't have anything to catch fire between the early mid-50s and 1961 when the Fantastic Four was launched late in that year. So it's not a story of plans undertaken knowingly or deliberately with some sense of grand design. It's really a slapdash, hell for leather, I got to feed my family, or from the Marvel point of view, can we keep this operation afloat? And that's one reason why this is so poorly documented, because no one really had any sense that they were consciously building a universe that would be a great thing. The Marvel Universe doesn't really arrive as an ideal until long after Marvel superhero comics arrive, and it arrives in kind of a piecemeal way as a promotional scheme. Right? So first it's just, what does Jack have for me this month? What does Steve Ditko have for me this month? That was pretty much it. So the risk level, they were already scraping by. See what I mean? So they were liberated. Yeah, Kirby's career graph, and then down and then up again, and he was eager, anxious for the work. Does that address your question? You have a follow-up question?
Sort of. The whole pop culture thing that happened with Marvel in the 60s, where they, literally on the Spider-Man's, the Marvel pop art production.
Yeah.
It seems interesting to me how that came about, because obviously Ditko, with his conservative views, and Kirby, already an older man, slaving away in a basement most of his career. And that wedded, who was it? Was it Lee that recognized and sort of wedded what was starting to happen to the ongoing pop culture of the 60s? Because neither of these guys seemed like the likely creator of
In the absence of other evidence, we have to assume that it was Stan Lee who decided to plaster Marvel pop art productions on the cover of Marvel Comics for a few months, and it was a canny decision. It was smart. I think the answer to that would have to have a lot of parts. At San Diego this summer, in the Comic Arts Conference, Andre Malottiu, who's an art historian, gave a talk about what he believes to have been not only Kirby's influence on pop art, but vice versa, by drawing sort of side-by-side comparisons between Roy Lichtenstein's infamous work of the 60s and Kirby's own subsequent responses. So it's clear that there's some dialogue between what we recognize as the fine arts and what the, if nothing else, the freelance artists working furiously in comic books were doing. It's interesting, I mean, Kirby was middle-aged when he was drawing so many of those comics that I showed you in the slideshow. Steve Ditko was a bit younger, but really was sort of a G.I. Bill era kind of cartoonist, studied under Jerry Robinson, worked his way up in the 40s and into the 50s. So these were not, flowers of the youth culture as we might think of in a kind of retrospective haze as we think about the 60s. But it's funny how often Ditko's art and Kirby's were appropriated for psychedelic posters. They were used in this sort of countercultural poster art, both Silver Surfer images, Doctor Strange, things like this were appropriated. And many of these readers who were in their 20s or late teens assumed that these guys must be dropping acid because, those comics are just so weird. I mean, they're fundamentally weird. But no, these were sort of guys, more or less staid middle-class guys trying to make a living. There's a big context. The first comic book conventions occur around 1964 and 65 in New York City and in the Midwest. The first articles in nationally renowned newspapers about old comic book collecting, like Zap Pow, did you know that you could, have to pay $20 for Superman's first issue? That's what they were saying in the 60s instead of saying $1 million, which is what we say now. So like the New York Times and other publications were running those articles, so there was a bit of a nostalgic cachet for a sort of, we might say, a baby boomer generation or even prior. There were things like Jules Feiffer's Playboy article, which became his book, The Great Comic Book Heroes, which appeared in 1965, right? I didn't realize when I was growing up in the early to mid-'70s reading comic books that they were already nostalgic for eras that preceded me, but nostalgia was informing everything. So there was this self-aware quality, as I mentioned in my talk, and I think the pop art sensibility goes with that. So people were aware that you could mine comics both for nostalgia, for irony, which was finally A, mainstreamed, and B, driven into the ground by the William Dozier and Company Batman TV series in 1966-ish, with Adam West and all of that. Clearly, people were trying to map that. There's a poignant little book that Jerry Siegel, the co-creator of Superman, worked on in the late 60s during that trend, a little paperback book he did about those campy superheroes. And it's poignant to see the guy who basically helped kickstart this whole genre trying to ride that trend, which was the sort of Zap Pow Bam trend of the Batman TV show. That's part of the pop art zeitgeist too, right? Does that get at your question? Yeah. Other questions, please. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this really gets me into opinionating. It's one thing to historicize and try to dig up the historical context. It's another thing for me to talk about the comics that I like and dislike and why. I'm not so keen on the colonization, elaboration, and constant rebooting of these comic book continuities, the kind that Jeff was referring to earlier, that now dominate. I know that a lot of people who work or have worked in the comic book industry get into it partly because they want to recapture that sort of Jones, that feeling that they had when they were reading Jack Kirby in the 60s or Steve Gerber or Jim Starlin or somebody like that in the 70s or Frank Miller in the 80s. And then a lot of these writers subsequently feel that they've been boxed in, right? They've been boxed in by a set of constraints, right? And the constraints often have to do with elaborately rigging the clockworks of a universe, right? So in my view, what Jack Kirby provided was a lot of raw material for a universe, but maybe not the discipline of the continuity. To go back to our first question or earlier, that raw material could be subsequently worked on and exploited. It's interesting that very, very often, I won't say always, but very, very often when DC Comics or Marvel Comics plans out and rigs a major event, something like the Age of Apocalypse that Jeff discussed earlier, but things like Crisis on Infinite Earths or Final Crisis, Fear Itself, things like this, that they're often going back to the Kirby well, right? Now, fair enough, they're also going back to the Chris Claremont, John Byrne well, the late 70s, early 80s, or to some other well, like the 90s. We're now nostalgic for the 90s in comic books. But they really need to go back to these kind of taproot stories that they continually retell. An excellent example of this from the late mid-'90s would be Alex Ross and Kurt Busiek's Marvel series, which does a photorealistic gloss, sort of man-on-the-street retake of mostly comics drawn by Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and John Romita in the 1960s. It's a very sophisticated and informed work. It's not as graphically vital to me, right? So what I look for in the history of superhero comics is those occasions when some sort of book that was on its death's door was given to somebody who was a relative newcomer into the American business and was given carte blanche because no one cared. No one cared about Daredevil when Frank Miller, well, some people did, but not so very many people were concerned about conserving Daredevil's present condition, in the early 80s when Frank Miller sort of grabbed the reins of that and began to run crazy with it. Who knew all those years that he had an undiscovered ninja girlfriend from college days? That wasn't in the continuity for a good part of 20 years. Miller said it was, suddenly retroactively it was, and it was as if it always was, and she, Elektra, was an electrifying character. When Alan Moore and company were given Swamp Thing in the early mid-'80s, Moore coming from that British generation and coming over, Steve Bissett, John Toddleben, the people that he worked with, again, they had a comic. It wasn't even a loss leader, because to imply that it was a loss leader would imply that it had prestige. What it had was a last-ditch chance to survive. So those people were set free. Now contrast that with something like what, let's say, George Perez has recently said about writing the Superman relaunch, for DC since last year or the year before. At every turn, he was stymied by editorial directives, and he would say, has said publicly, that the editorial directives weren't even consistent, that they would shift from one month or one run of issues to another. And so as much as he hated to admit it, he was so eager to leave it behind when he was done, because he was fatigued by working on it. That's DC's New 52. So you see how the companies inherit this enormous sense of scope from a handful of creators in past years, and then they colonize it, but the result is sort of conference table comics. I'm more interested in the generative act of cartooning, right? But that's my bias. So I think that's one way in which you could argue that things that become big, rigged, self-important, maybe not so vital as, but that's my yardstick. Yeah. So one more question? Yeah, Michael.
There's been a lot of debate in the past couple months on various message boards about to what extent Jack Kirby moved a lot of the Simon & Kirby material in the 40s and 50s.
Right.
I just read a bunch of late 40s, early 50s romance stories by them, and it sure read like Jack Kirby to me.
Mm-hmm.
The dialogue, the themes,
Mm-hmm.
even the word choices
Mm-hmm.
sounded like Jack Kirby.
Mm.
I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't wish to denigrate the late Joe Simon, but a lot of people have had that thought that Kirby was sort of this thrumming engine, and everyone else around him was either trying to keep up or trying to manage his productivity, his gift. Now, Joe Simon himself was a gifted layout man, a guy with a background in design and journalism. He was a pretty facile cartoonist himself, but his career exploded in a wholly different direction, obviously, when he began to work with Kirby. Kirby lacked Simon's confident self-estimation, I think. I mean, part of this is from Joe Simon's version of the story, so it's a little hard to judge, but we know that Kirby was so desperate to earn money to support his parents, for example, in the 30s and early 40s, that Simon would nudge him and say, no, let's go to this other publisher, let's moonlight over here, let's do this. Either nobody will find out, or it'll be such a lucrative gig it won't matter, right? It did kind of matter for Martin Goodman, publisher of Captain America comics, because he fired Simon and Kirby in 1942 when he discovered they were working for another publisher. But Simon had guts, and he sort of took a big risk. Also, Kirby said in one interview, you may know this, that Simon was a middle-class guy, and Kirby was a ghetto kid. And so he looked at his partner as sort of an aspirational target to be how to be a professional, how to be a good earning sort of man, So he got a lot from Simon. It can't be denied. But he often claimed that he always liked to make up the plots himself. And some people who worked in the Simon and Kirby shop, which was sometimes a really busy shop with a lot of comings and goings, would say, oh yeah, Jack was great for plots. He would plot his own, or he would give a plot or a plot fix to somebody else in the shop. Now the thing about Simon and Kirby is that, they were jobbers. I mean, the output of that shop is really inconsistent in terms of its finish, who drew it, how good was it in a particular time. And so it's hard to do any sort of auteurist or authorial reading, even harder, I think, for Simon Kirby in some cases than it is for early Marvel, and it's already hard there. But yeah, I believe that. Like reading Michel Gagne's young romance collection that's been out recently, where you see a variety of artists working on Simon and Kirby romance comics, but the ones that really catch fire to me seem not only graphically but narratively driven by a set of concerns or preoccupations that are Kirby's. I mean, is that your sense of it? He said he always preferred to do the plots, but it wasn't until late in his career that he felt compelled to claim this, right? You see? And so, but because it's very poorly documented, we also always have to discount the fog of memory. But I read, Kirby continuously across the years. You know that he did Thor in the Sandman comic, Villain from Valhalla, back in 1942 or 43, and then did Thor again in the late 50s, and did Thor in 1962 for Marvel. So these preoccupations are kind of his. Yeah. That's all the time for questions that we have, but thank you for your attention. Thanks very much.